Welcome back to another episode of the Taiwanology podcast. This is your host, Kwangyin from Taiwan's CommonWealth magazine. So today we're addressing one of my favorite topics, which is the bike industry. And we have my favorite person in the studio, which we will introduce sometime later. So to start, for decades, Taiwan has been known as the bicycle kingdom, which is the quiet force powering high-end bikes on the streets of London, New York, and Paris. In the 1990s, Taiwan made most of the world's bicycles. Now, still around half of high-end bicycles are made by Taiwanese companies all over the world. But now, that kingdom is under pressure. From the aggressive tech-driven rise of China's e-bike giants like Xidesheng XDS to a growing push in Europe to bring manufacture back home, Taiwan's most iconic industry is facing an existential squeeze, some might say. Joining us today is Elisa Chiu Huaixuan. She is the founder of Anchor Global, which is a platform that enables cross-border and cross-industry innovation, and is also entirely founded in Taiwan. So Anchor Global was formerly Anchor Taiwan. Now it's going global. So I'm really glad to see the change. She's also the driving force behind Bike Venture. Well, she's not here today to talk about gears and frames in the traditional sense, but about capital, survival, software, and why the future of the bicycle industry is still very much related to Taiwan's future. So Elisa, welcome to the studio.
Thank you, Kwangyin. Thanks for having me.
Right. I think this is really long overdue. We have known each other for maybe a decade now.
Yes, going there.
We keep running into each other. And so I am very interested in and why you were drawn to the bike industry. But first of all, you have a very unique background in finance, I believe. So you have started in Wall Street managing billions of dollars of assets. So tell us how you got here.
Well, I did start my career from the Wall Street and initially in Hong Kong. As you mentioned, before I left, I managed billions of assets. And then afterwards, I actually moved to Silicon Valley to really add more experience and expertise around early stage tech investments and innovation ecosystem building. In 2017, I started this platform called Anchor Taiwan and now Anchor Global. And I think these days, a lot of people ask me, how did you actually move from being in the Wall Streets into the traditional industries, I guess, especially around the bicycle industry that we're going to talk about today? Some might think that the bicycle industry is, quote unquote, relatively unsexy.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you make that move? Yeah, I think I actually never saw the bike industry as unsexy. I think it may be less buzzy or less hyped these days compared with, let's say, AI or semiconductors. And obviously, the market size is definitely smaller than some of the other industries. But I think it doesn't mean that it's less important. And I think for me and for Anchor, when we try to decide which industries to work on, it's never about which keywords or which industries are more fashionable. I think it's more around which industries actually there are things worth doing.
Right.
And where can we actually make real contributions? So for me, the bike industry actually sits at a very interesting intersections of mobility, of sustainability, smart cities, and increasingly technology. So it may look traditional from the outside, but then it actually touches upon many aspects that really matters for the future. And beyond that, it's also a super endearing industry. You know, it's very tangible with the products, with the stories, with the people. Yeah, and I basically myself got into cycling, which fundamentally changed my life.
Yes.
So I think, both personally and professionally, I think this is really the industry that I'm very happy to be a part of.
We'll get to the story of how you started cycling later. But I think for most of our listeners who might know that Taiwan has a really competitive company called TSMC making chips and semiconductors, but many people might not know about the history of Taiwan's bike industry. So as I said in the introduction, used to make most of the world's high-end bikes and is still making a lot of them today. So how did Taiwan become the hub of bike manufacturing in decades ago?
Yeah, in Taiwan, central Taiwan, around Taichung and Zhanghua. So, like within an hour or so by car, we have hundreds and hundreds of companies, factories, big and small, related to the bike value
Making
chain.
frames, tires,
Frames, tires, like all sort of
chains.
different components, assembly.
Right.
And when it comes to this, I think it's a very unique cluster economy. So, like in Taiwan, we have similar things with semiconductor, with other industries as well.
Right.
And I think the bike industry, there's no exception. And around this, I remember that a friend of mine, Azizi Tucker, who was sent by Tesla years ago to come to Asia to survey the supply chain, he once told me something that really stayed with me. So he told me that Taiwan has the shortest distance between your dream and reality.
Right. That's so well said.
Yeah, I like that really stayed with me, and I resonate a lot with that. Because in terms of this, I think being small is actually a blessing. So the reality is that within an hour, you have hundreds of suppliers along the value chain. So being small means that we can be very agile, we can be flexible, we can be fast. And I think, like when it comes to making bicycles, especially, increasingly more and more customized products, especially with early stage prototyping and so on and so forth, that's how and when Taiwan can actually bring a lot to the world partners.
So we started by saying that there has been a squeeze for Taiwan's bike industry, and it's because we have noticed that, and also my colleagues have been reporting on the story of the rising challenge from Chinese competitors like Shidesheng, XDS. So I read about the rise of this Shenzhen-based company. Last year they became the first Chinese brand behind a major Tour de France team, the Astana team. So this is a brand, Xidesheng, XDS for short. And I don't believe it's the only Chinese company, bike company, that's catching up to the Taiwanese major players like Giant and Merida and other people. So how challenging is the situation for Taiwanese brands? Because we have seen some rather alarmist reporting in the past few months.
Well, before answering this question directly, I would like to make one point first. I feel like in Taiwan, a lot of time discussions about the bicycle industry very often will fall into this Taiwan versus China narrative, or sometimes even like Taiwan versus China only narrative. And I think this comparison is important, but then it can also be a trap. Because I think, of course, China matters and it absolutely deserves serious attention. We actually pay a lot of attention to not just Shidesheng, but also other companies like Fushida, Tenways, a lot of other companies. But I think what we're seeing is not just cheap manufacturing, because Chinese players these days are definitely catching up when it comes to technology, when it comes to higher quality, when it comes to how they are willing to invest in branding, in, say, for example, what you mentioned, sponsoring Tour de France teams, and so on and so forth. All of this is real. In some cases, the competition actually comes from not just the traditional bike sector. One visible example is DJI. These days, everybody is talking about
the drone manufacturer
exactly,
is also getting to bikes.
Yes. And just in 2 years, now they are changing the game. So I think it really reminds us that the next wave of competition may not come from the legacy bike industry, but it comes from a lot of other areas that might surprise us. So I think the most important question in Taiwan is not whether we can beat China. I think, what we should do is to come back to the first principles. What problems are we trying to solve? And especially what problems are we trying to solve for the future? Because I think China is part of the story, but it's not the whole story. And then so if we continue to compare ourselves with China and look at them in terms of what they can do, in terms of the speed, the scope, the scale,
Or the costs.
the cost, we will always struggle, and then it's probably not really going to get us to where we deserve to be and where we should be. So I think when it comes to this, I really hope that we can come out of this binary comparison. We should definitely study what some of the Chinese companies are doing, especially when they are now changing sometimes in some cases the paradigm when it comes to system, when it comes to data, when it comes to AI. But I think for us, we should also recognize that fundamentally we're very different in terms of our market size, in terms of what we're good at, in terms of the whole kind of like industry history. So that's some thoughts.
Right. Yeah. I think you made some really very important points that we shouldn't just look at the competitors as what can we, can we be cheaper? Can we be faster or larger scale? Because that's just unattainable. So maybe we should try to select a different track. Right. So we should excel in other aspects and rather than just racing to the bottom. Right. And also, you mentioned before that the Anchor Taiwan and Anchor Global, there will have been some workshops trying to bring together cross-industry synergy. And also, you said that like DJI, the drone manufacturer, getting into bikes, there are also companies in Taiwan which were not traditionally bike manufacturers. Like, so we have the ICT players like Acer, Darphon, and Delta Electronics have also been investing in bike-related products. How can you create synergy for them in the industry?
I have to say it's a lot harder than what most people would imagine. Even though
Why?
we have been trying to enable this for years and years and years, even before we started focusing on the bike industry. But we really believe in the value with cross-industry collaboration. And the reason is that, say, for example, in the bike industry, these days, a lot of new business models and new trends that we're seeing is actually not new. Like it might have already happened in other industries.
Can you give an example?
So, for example, these days in the bike industry, increasingly the leasing model, the subscription model, like post-sale services, financing, and so on and so forth. These are actually now very strong waves that changed the traditional business models in the bike industry.
Right.
So in the past, especially for a lot of Taiwanese stakeholders, they see bikes as just kind of like a product, one-time transaction.
Mm-hmm.
I build something, I sell it to you.
Right.
But nowadays it's very different, especially with the subscription model, the leasing model. Increasingly, bike is not just a product. Like it basically can be a mobility asset.
Okay.
So you need to really understand, in some cases, even how the financing structure works and so on and so forth. A lot of this are very new for people from the bike industry. However, this is not new at all for the automotive industry. It has been going on for years and years and years. So
Right.
why is cross-industry kind of like either collaboration or exchange so valuable? Because imagine if you have an opportunity to actually talk to people from the automotive industry, say, for example, early on, then you might be the first to either sense the change in the bike industry or even create business opportunities around this. So I think that's one of the main reasons. And because we come from this cross-industry background, so with one foot in one industry and the other foot in another, very often we saw opportunities. And that's also why we try to rally people from both sides. But it's very difficult because fundamentally, people from the traditional industries and from high-tech industries, they come from very different product cycle.
Right.
Very different expectations with MOQs, very different expectation, and like with speed, with culture, and so on and so forth. So how do you actually create the right container and platform?
So how do you become the bridge between them?
It's very difficult. A lot of time it's about translation. So how do you actually, first, you need to build trust on both sides.
Right.
And it takes time. I think a lot of time there's no shortcuts. You just really need to continue showing up. You need to continue prove that you are bringing value. You need to continue basically kind of like give them evidence that you care and then you're here to stay. So I think trust, and also try to, like basically translate what they're trying to do and what they're trying to say.
And what's their anxiety also?
Yeah, exactly. Because a lot of time, I think I really still believe that a lot of fundamental collaboration, the key is the people's relationship. One of the companies that you just mentioned, say, for example, I was actually very surprised when we launched Byte Venture in 2024. They never had real interaction with Giant, for example. And for me, I think the fact that there was no collaboration, a lot of time it might just because there was no proper opportunity for the people. And we're not talking about just kind of like companies' names, but like people. I feel like a lot of time we just really need people to sit down on the same table and start kind of like trying to get to know each other
they
first.
Haven't talked to each other.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right. And then very often I feel like that's where long-term collaboration kicks off.
Right. Is there one example of collaboration that you have facilitated that you can maybe mention as an example of? Yeah.
Maybe not in details and not revealing the names.
Okay.
Yes. But then I can actually show or share one example in terms of why this kind of exchange or connection can bring a lot of value. So one of the major ICT companies in Taiwan, years ago, they were trying to develop this kind of like special glasses with AR function, thinking that this would be basically popular among cyclists.
Right.
But then they basically, started doing this because they have the technology, they have the patent, they have, the teams to put this together. So they built a prototype and then they essentially started kind of like trying to push this to the markets already. But with the cross-industry roundtable, like at one of the roundtables that we put together back then, they came across Giants. And then so they were like, hey, maybe now we have this opportunity to verify whether this is actually a good idea or whether they're basically thinking or imagining that there's a need for cyclists for that kind of products. And then so they basically went on with discussions around the actual cycling world, how they would see these products, what kind of features would matter, and so on and so forth. And this ICT company actually realized that a lot of their original features and their kind of like product specs were not addressing what cyclists actually need. So very often in Taiwan, we still see companies developing products in silos in their own kind of like world. So I think, if you have opportunities for this kind of cross-industry conversations even early on, you can also avoid a lot of cost and a lot of unnecessary kind of like time and investments.
Waste. So talk before you even proceeded to develop or make these products.
Exactly.
Right?
So I think how to create a structure and even a mechanism to enable more of that conversation that either turn into collaboration or turn into wisdom in terms of what should be focused on or how to best utilize time and resources, I believe that would be very valuable and important.
Right. So, Elisa, I know that you are also a very enthusiastic cyclist yourself. How did it start for you? How did you start cycling?
Well, I don't know how much time we have to talk about this story, but essentially, I think to a certain extent, I think I have Anchor to thank because back then we were basically building this whole corporate innovation and corporate venturing ecosystem here in Taiwan. And when we were doing that, we basically were trying to bring high-tech sector with the traditional sector together. And at the time, one of the companies that we invited from the traditional industry was Giant Group, Giant Bicycle. And Bonnie too, who was the chairperson at the time, she was very open-minded, very curious. So she immediately sent someone to be part of this whole roundtable. And because of that, I had this opportunity to be invited to go on this round the island cycling trip.
How exciting.
With them. Yeah. So at the time, I was like, well, people say that there are three things that you need to do to be Taiwanese.
Right.
Either you swim through Salmon Lake, you climb Mount Jade, or you cycle around Taiwan.
And this is one of them.
This is one of them. And then the first two, I thought for me it was kind of challenging. But then I thought, okay, cycling around Taiwan.
Because you were never sporty. You never really cycled.
No, I was not really never a cyclist before. But then when I received that invitation, I was like, this can be something that I might be able to do. So I think I spent the next few months train on U-bike because I didn't have a bike myself.
Okay, you trained on U-bike.
Yes, so I started training on U-bike, and then a few months later, I joined a group on this round the island cycling trip.
How did it go?
It went, well, first few days, I have to say, was really painful because I guess just to give people an idea, if you want to cycle around Taiwan, the most typical routes and time would be, it takes about 9 days. And then usually every day you cycle on average about 100 kilometers. So sometimes more, sometimes a little bit less, but usually like around 100 kilometers. And then so the first couple of days, oh my God, my butt's really hurts and my whole body just like, yeah. But then I think more and more, I started enjoying that process and that journey. And that trip really transformed me. I think both personally and professionally. Obviously, now I'm doing a lot with the industry.
You're a bike person now.
Yeah. And I feel like being a cyclist myself definitely helps because I feel like even though I think compared with a lot of people who were born into the bicycle industry, I'm definitely still relatively new, still learning a lot. But as a cyclist, I feel like I could relate to so much in terms of, even the product. And now I have so many friends from the bicycle industry. So I also feel like this is not just business. This is actually deeply personal for me as well.
This is a new lifestyle, I could tell. So I could also tell that this means a lot to you personally and professionally. So back to on a professional side, I read something interesting. I think it's what you shared on LinkedIn as well. Earlier this year, there's the bike show in Taiwan. There was a very interesting panel discussion organized by European Cycling Industries, which was one of the most powerful industry associations in Europe. And it appears that a lot of the talk by the European bike leaders was about reshoring of bike manufacturing to Europe. What's your take on that?
Well, I think the interest in reshoring is completely understandable, especially given during COVID, with the issue with the supply chains and so on and so forth. And also in terms of, the expectation that reshoring will create jobs and help with the economy and so on and so forth. But I think in 2026, we can actually look at reshoring with a different lens and perhaps a different definition. I think a lot of time when people think about reshoring, automatically people think about moving the production line, moving the supply chain, building factories, buying lands in Europe. Mm-hmm. However, I feel like we can probably zoom out a little bit. I feel like the new form of reshoring can actually be broader than that. It can be, say, for example, how can Asian supply chain stakeholders invest in European startups? And how can European investors, for example, PE funds and so on and so forth, co-invest with Asian supply chain, like stakeholders and so on and so forth? So I think while we move across border, probably in the future, we don't need to limit that with just factories or lands or manufacturing itself. I think a lot of time, capital, talents, ideas, I think the future reshoring should probably be about how do we co-create a more resilient supply chain. Right. And it probably, in my imagination, it shouldn't need to limit to the old form of factory buildings by Asian or Taiwanese people in Europe. So that's also why I think, we should probably enable more awareness and also more channels for discussion around that as well.
So you're saying that the collaboration can be in the form of capital and talent and ideas. And why do you think this has not happened before?
Many, many reasons. Well, one, the reality is that for the bike industry in Taiwan, traditionally, they haven't really been very open to the capital markets. One, because they may not be very familiar with the international capital markets language.
Like VC?
VC may not be the most suitable vehicle for many reasons for supply chain. But say, for example, for PE funds, how does it work?
Mm-hmm.
Even with public markets going IPO and so on and so forth, for a lot of stakeholders from the traditional industry, not just bike, but just in general,
Right.
either in the past, they didn't feel like there's that need
Mm-hmm.
because, they probably had enough cash
They've been
in their bank.
profitable and it's a
Exactly.
family business.
It's a family business. They don't really want outside stakeholders or outside investors. And also because they didn't realize that there's that option. And also, with the right investor, sometimes it's not just about money. It's really about strategic alliance. It's about how to expand beyond the current scope. However, I think now we are at a very interesting pivotal point because many companies in Taiwan, some of them are actually facing this succession challenge. So maybe in the past, they never thought about having an outside investor or even going public.
Are they opening their minds now?
I think more and more. I actually started seeing more and more companies, even from Taiwan, started looking at that possibilities. Let's say if their sons or daughter are not interested in taking over, but how do they identify the right investors, either through the public markets or through professional institutional investors, to extend the legacy and then to basically kind of continue with what they have already built.
Right.
And at the same time, I think another interesting trend that we're seeing, especially happening in China, is that I think historically, companies in China, they have been more aggressive when it comes to utilizing capital markets for their global expansion. And it's happening in the bike industry these days as well, including like last year, we saw Dahang, so for example, got listed in Hong Kong. This year, now it's April already, but then, we already saw 10 Ways listed, they filed to be listed in Hong Kong. And Fushi, for example, they also filed to be listed in Shanghai. So when the industry is actually going through this downturn, for companies that are savvy enough to know how to utilize capital markets, they would be able to continue to build their R&D and innovation capacity. They will be able to continue to build factories and so on and so forth. It's going to make a huge difference.
Right.
I think that's something that we should definitely pay more attention to.
Because the capital market is good now. So it's actually good time to take advantage of that. Right. So I really like the idea of utilizing capital and talent instead of just physical reshoring, right? So another question is about e-bikes. I think a lot of people are talking about e-bikes. The Taiwanese brands have cited e-bikes as really important growth track for their companies. So what are the future of e-bikes now? Are we to think like EVs that are just computers with wheels? Are bikes going to be like that? And how do you convince the very traditional thinking parts manufacturers to speak a different language?
That's a very good question. And I have to say, I think probably we can look at this with two layers. One is the e-bike manufacturing itself. And two is really a completely new game and new business model going forwards. So first, when it comes to e-bike manufacturing, I think the reality is that Taiwan is falling behind when it comes to e-bike.
Why is that?
The reality is, even though we have a very strong bike industry, we also have a very strong consumer electronics and high-tech industry. But so far, we haven't really seen the true fruits in terms of integration and collaboration between those two. So essentially, in the last decades or so, we have seen, in terms of e-bike, the high-end space for motors and so on and so forth is dominated by Germany. And then, like Bosch, for example. And then, like mid-level, mid-range, probably we have Shimano, Yamaha, and so on and so forth. And we have a whole bunch of other players like Bafang from China, which is lower cost mass markets. That has been kind of like how the ecosystem looks like. And in the last 2 years, as we mentioned a little bit just now, DJI basically came out being super aggressive in challenging the status quo. And when it comes to that, because 10, 20 years ago, Taiwan actually picked a very different journey. So we focus on high-end bikes, road bikes, especially. So we sort of, in a way, missed the boat when it comes to that e-bike development. So I think when it comes to e-bike manufacturing, obviously we still have a meaningful share. But then if you look at the actual export number from Taiwan, or even globally, when we look at the total number of e-bikes manufactured by Taiwanese companies, we still have a meaningful share. But then that dominance, that share is definitely decreasing. However, I think that may not be the most concerning thing to worry about. I think we should probably think about the second layer that I mentioned. The reality is the future of the e-bike or even the micromobility, the mobility sector is changing very fast. I think in the future, a huge part of vehicles, both four-wheelers or two-wheelers, will be increasingly become commodities.
Okay.
So basically, we should think about systems. We should think about data. We should think about how this product is no longer a product.
You're talking about business models.
Yes.
Right. So
yes.
we need new business model because the old business model is I make and I sell, then you own, and maybe you buy a new one in 5 years or something. But you're saying that we should think complete different business models, like what you said, shared or leasing or any kind of other added value products.
Definitely. And we should try to understand those new business models relatively earlier, and also try to see how to continue to utilize our strengths in those new business models, either participate or invest or do whatever we can do to stay relevant.
Right. So you're saying that actually we shouldn't focus on e-bikes per se, but think about new business models and think about what Taiwanese companies can do, right? So I would like to end this episode on a positive note. So we have mentioned a lot of challenges, for example, competitors from China who are getting very savvy, and they're also on the capital market, and a lot of innovation. And the Taiwanese companies are they're smaller and maybe slower, and they have to be more open-minded. So how can the Taiwanese bike industry stay relevant and maybe onto the next chapter?
Well, I think get out there, get closer to the markets. I think it's very important. Coming back to what we mentioned a little bit just now, come back to first principles.
Which
really try to understand what the world needs, what the consumers needs. I think, like even looking at the business model, that's also second layer already. And I think the only way to truly understand what the world or the consumer needs is to get out there. So I think the key is get out of the comfort zone, especially being in Taiwan. It's very important not to just stay here and not to just go out for the sake of trying to sell to your customers. I think trying to get to the roots and trying to understand what the world needs and try to see what role we can play around that will be the key. I cannot tell you that I have the answers already, but then I think the key or something that we never stop doing is put ourselves out there, either go to international trade shows and not just go there for the sake of having a booth there, hoping to get deals, but really get into the mainstream of international markets, of international organizations, trying to be the first to, with the first-hand observations. And I think that, I believe, will start getting us some data points and some inspirations in terms of what we can potentially do next.
I think you yourself, you are organizing a very special tour to get out there, right? You're going to Walmart. What can you tell us about that?
In fact, I don't see that as a tour. I think what you mentioned just now probably is related to this initiative that we launched this year, which is part of Anchor Industry Lab.
Yes.
Yeah. And even though, when people look at our pilot program for the lab this year, a lot of people will notice, obviously, the Walmart ecosystem and also this trip to Bentonville. However, the rationale or the background with the industry lab is actually way beyond that. So what we see is that in Taiwan, we probably don't need another event or another trip or another course. But what we need is a structure and a mechanism to really internalize a lot of these learnings and a lot of these simulations into the language and the action that within corporates people can carry forward. So the Anchor Industry Lab is actually a research-based mechanism. So last year, we actually spent quite a bit of time and energy to select about 6 cases around the world, and Walmart being one of them. And we picked Walmart because there's actually many interesting things that we can learn about. People look at Walmart as a retail kingdom or a retail really kind of like pioneer. Mm-hmm. But in reality, the Walton family and Walmart, they have been doing a lot of interesting things when it comes to the bicycle industry.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, so the whole Bentonville is actually almost like a lab itself for retail, for like innovation with the bicycle industry, with supply chain, with brands, with accelerators, with investments, with local infrastructure.
All bike related.
Many things, what I just mentioned, they were all bike related. So it's a very systematic ways to really work on things, and a lot of those things are intertwined. So basically what we are trying to do, similar to other cases that we pick as well, is to really look at how we can learn from those cases. And not just through learning, but how do we actually engage with real world connections and potentially collaboration. So that's why for the pilot program, we first will go through the case studies together. We'll prepare the cohort members and bring up and align the language and understanding in terms of what's going on there. And then we engage with the real world immersion. And maybe more importantly, after we come back, we really want to push companies to internalize what we learned into actual action plans.
Okay, so who will be the participants?
Now we're finalizing, but then we have already got quite a few second-generation business leaders from the bike industries that are eager to learn and that realizes that, like we cannot wait anymore. So we need to get ourselves out there and start taking actions. So we're very excited about these possibilities and about co-creating this with this group of either existing and future leaders for the bike industry from Taiwan.
Wow, that sounds very exciting. I'm also looking forward to learning from you more of your takeaways from this industry lab in Bentonville.
Definitely.
Great. So it's been a really pleasant chat. Thank you, Elisa, again for coming into the studio and having this conversation. So also thank you all for listening to Taiwanology. We will be back with a new episode on May 26th. To read more stories about Taiwan's cycling industry and its transformations, please check out CommonWealth Magazine's English website. So see you next time. Thank you, Elisa.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.